Hello, I'm Nicole Gauthier, professor of plant pathology at the University of Kentucky. And today we're going to be talking about the persistence of woody plant diseases with a focus on tree fruit. So I am going to share my screen here, and we're going to discuss some of the more common diseases of orchard fruit and some management options for those diseases. So woody diseases, if you will. So we're going to kind of lump them into some big, broad categories. So the first of the stem and trunk diseases, if you will, are cankers. And when we talk about cankers, those are woody stem lesions that start from outside of that woody tissue and they work their way in. Basically, they're going to penetrate through the cambium. So some examples of cankering diseases are fire blight, the cankering phase, black rot or bod canker, so that's black rot on apple, for example, and perennial canker or Cytospora canker. That's a familiar cankering disease on peach. Another group of diseases on woody tissue of orchard fruit are the tip blights. So we think about diseases that affect branch tips entering through the meristems, so into that actively growing tissue. And some really common examples are Phomopsis tip blight on blueberry, or when we see fire blight, the shepherd's crook phase or the tip blight phase of fire blight in the later in the spring. And there are a third general group of stem and trunk diseases of woody plants, or the vascular wilts. And that's an internal rot or an internal infection. So infection of the xylem tissue where you'll see some necrosis. Some common ones there are like oak wilt and Dutch elm disease. We don't have any major vascular wilts of tree fruit diseases. So from here on, I'm not going to talk about vascular wilts. I'm going to focus on cankers and tip blights. And for those of you who know me, you know we've got to take a break and learn some sciencey stuff. So let's get a little bit of a botany lesson just so we can get some understanding of how to manage these diseases and why we make the recommendations that we do. So, okay, this is a cross section of a woody tree. Very generalized here, but we'll start from the center of this cross section, the very center of a tree, of a trunk of a tree or a major branch is the pith. So outside of that, as we kind of work our way outward, we start to see the xylem tissue. So the xylem is the vascular tissue that takes water and nutrients upward. So the xylem goes from the roots, it goes upwards towards branch tips, leaves, etc. So xylem goes up. And then again, working our way back outward, then we'll see the phloem. And the phloem is when the sap goes downwards. So once the sugars are produced by photosynthesis and the processes of biological chemistry, those sugars and those nutrients go back down. So that's when we see those storage carbohydrates. That's where we get the power for growth and to store nutrients or to store energy. And then finally, as we work our way out, so there's some cambium layers in between there and the very outside, we start getting into that cork cambium. And that's the part where I was talking earlier about our cankering diseases penetrating the cambium. I was talking about the cork cambium. So that's kind of that external layer. And then, of course, we have our bark on the outside. And then one other thing I just want to kind of call attention to is when we talk about tip blights, I mentioned meristem or that apical meristem. And that meristem is that actively growing tissue right there in that tip. So we'll see on the right and left here, we see leaves, and then the far back of that meristem, you'll see a third leaf and that kind of U-shaped organelle or that U-shaped tissue that's right in that center. That's the apical meristem. So that's what we call undifferentiated cells. So those cells don't quite yet have a purpose. They're open, they're actively growing, and they're very vulnerable to infections. And so they're a good place that a lot of pathogens will enter. So when I talk about apical meristem, that's what I'm talking about. All right, so back to our pathology. Cankers. I talked about cankers. Cankers are the most common of the woody plant diseases. And again, a canker is a woody plant lesion. It can occur on the branches, on the trunk, on any woody part. In general, that pathogen will enter from the outside and it'll work its way, penetrating the cambium, working its way on the inside. Now think about bacterial cells and fungal spores and just how small they are. They're microscopic, they're very tender, so they don't have the power to penetrate the bark of a tree, for example. And that's why we're always saying, we're always telling you to avoid wounding, because wounds or natural openings or any kind of opening is the way these pathogens get in. So a wound can be something we don't intend to do. It can be insect damage. It could be damage from hail or something like that. Or it could be some wound that we create. Think about a pruning cut. So the image you see here is a canker around right in that center. That's a small branch that was cut there. So that was the entry wound. So again, cankers from the outside, they work their way in, they penetrate through that cambium, and then that plant doesn't have a lot of defenses. So that's the way the cambium, that's the way a canker works. And this is something that I got out of an avocado research journal. So from the Avocado Society research, but this is a canker coming from the outside. So this is what a cross section would look like. And this is pretty much what any canker would look like. The image on the left shows that V-shaped lesion. So the canker moving its way in, and the one on the right, that canker is much larger. It's taken up a much larger part of this branch. So think about when you see a canker from the outside, what would it look like if you made that cross section cut? And then again, let's revisit those tip blights. Infection is through the meristem, working its way downward. And that meristem, recall, is a natural opening. Those are those undifferentiated cells. That's that growing tip. And that infection will come into those meristematic tips and move their way downward. And as long as conditions are right, it will keep moving. So the image here is fire blight going in through that blossom tip, or that actively growing tip, working its way down that spur, and then making a turn. And so it's on its way down a branch. And here's another close-up. This one, this is from the Australasian plant disease notes, but here is a meristem. Infection occurred, you'll see that disease kind of working its way down. See that discoloration working its way down. So a tip blight starts at the tip, you'll usually see wilting, and that tip blight will progress as it goes lower down the branch. So starts out very small and it just works its way down. Okay, so where does all these fungi and these bacteria come from? We call that inoculum. So those bacterial cells and those fungal spores, we call those inoculum. Little bit of a sciencey word, but think about that's the infective propagule. They are introduced into the orchard by some measure, right? It would be an infected plant, or we bring it in, and then from there we have a monocultured system. Our apple orchards, our peach orchards, our blueberry fields, they're generally monoculture. So once disease takes a hold, or once a pathogen establishes itself, it can just move from plant to plant because it's got an all-you-can-eat buffet. In the winter, plants go dormant. Generally, these cankering or tip blight pathogens will also go dormant, and they overwinter in that infected tissue. They enter through a new infection, a new site, usually through wounds or some plant stress with natural wounds. And in the right climate, they will sporulate and they will spread, disseminate those spores or those bacterial cells, and they spread to new healthy tissues. So we just have this cycle of infection and disease over and over again. Let's take a little bit closer look at some of these cases. On the left, those are blueberries. And if you look right in the center of each of those three cankers, this is Fusicoccum, but you see the little orange dots in there. Those are fungal spores. So that's accumulation of fungal spores there. And that's what happens. Usually in the spring, when conditions are wet, we have moderate temperatures, lots of free water, high humidity, rain events. So you'll have that sporulation. And then all we need at that point usually is wind-driven rain to take those spores onto clean tissue or healthy tissue that could be wounded or have some variation of a natural opening. And then the image on the right, that is bacterial canker on peach. Peach do a lot of oozing of sap. So the sap you see is a plant's reaction to a canker. So that canker is harder to see because all of that sap is in the way. But this is bacterial canker and it's pretty distinct. But if you have an insect borer or if you have another cankering disease, it could look a lot like that. All right, so what we're here to say basically is fungicides don't work on cankering diseases and tip blight diseases. There's no way for those fungicides to absorb through that woody tissue. Remember I told you that absorption occurs through the xylem. The xylem goes up, so it takes water and nutrients. And if you have a systemic fungicide up that plant, up towards the actively growing parts, and in terms of woody plant diseases, we don't have the ability to translocate those products because the xylem, remember that it was on the inside of that cross section and we're spraying our fungicides on the outside. So we're not reaching that xylem tissue. There's no way for it to be absorbed or translocated. So when we talk about these woody stem diseases, whether it's cankers or tip blights and vascular wilts too, for that matter, we're not going to have the movement of those fungicides. They're not going where we need them. They're in the wrong place. Even if we had a way to inject or to get those fungicides in, they're not in the right place. They're not at that cambium. They're not on that surface. So the xylem tissue is way on the inside, like I showed you in that second slide. All right, so why do we use bactericides and fungicides? Why are they in the spray guide? Well, because we're using them as preventatives, right? We're using those contact products to build a protective layer around our plant parts, especially those wounds and those actively growing parts, so that if a pathogen spore or bacterial cell lands there, it's not able to infect. So we're creating a force field, if you will, protecting any new tissue. And if you're wondering what kind of fungicides or what kind of products are those, refer to the Midwest Fruit Workers Fruit Production Guide. And that's one, we'll have some links in the description, but we always list the products that are recommended. And if you'll notice, they're all early season and they're all going to be protectants. So the lesson here is knowing the limits of fungicides and bactericides, really expecting that they're not going to cure, they're not even going to reach where they need to reach if you wait until infection has already occurred. Okay, so how do you manage woody plant diseases? Through cultural practices. I talk a lot about sanitation and a lot about cultural practices, and this is the one place that approach really shines. So the first thing we're going to do is remove infected tissue. That might be a small branch, it might be a large branch, and I hope for your sake it's not an entire trunk, right? So removing infected wood, so we're taking that infected tissue away so that in the spring we're not going to have that sporulation and those infective propagules being disseminated onto healthy wood. So you got to prune it out. And what do you do with that pruning cut? You're not dropping it to the middles and leaving it there. So pruning onto a tarp, pruning, getting it out of there. Never leave your cuttings in the orchard. Never drop them on the bare ground. We never really pick up as many as we should. So pruning right onto a tarp or right into a cart is the best bet. If you have a bacterial infection in particular, let me say fire blight, you're going to sanitize between cuts. So fire blight and bacterial canker of peach, sanitizing between cuts. That could be a bucket with multiple pairs of pruners there. That could be some kind of cleaning in between trees. But in particular, if you have an outbreak, you're going to have to do this. And I know it's a slow process, but sanitizing between cuts will prevent you from spreading those bacterial cells to the next tree. And we tend to do most of this pruning while we're doing our spring pruning, right? So we're taking care of diseased wood as well as shaping. And that's when we have a high risk of spreading, especially if it's late winter, early spring, when things are starting to warm up and those pathogens are starting to break that dormancy. You have a lot higher risk of spread. Okay, so sum it all up. How do we manage woody plant diseases in the orchard? We're going to reduce inoculum. We're going to cut away and take out any infected wood. So that reduces the amount of bacterial cells and fungal spores. Secondly, we're going to prevent wounds as much as possible. So when we do make a cut, we're making a very sharp cut, unlike that image there to the left where you've got that frayed end. So a clean cut is going to callus over much faster. We're going to maintain plant health. So stressed plants have lots of natural openings, lots of weak immune system, if you will, and ability to become infected. And then we're going to use preventative fungicides to protect our healthy wood so that these pathogens cannot enter. Where do you get more information? I know I've said a lot. I dove down a little bit, but then I was still pretty general and I didn't give you a lot of solutions here except pruning and preventing wounds. So you can learn a lot more by going to our Department of Plant Pathology website. That's plantpathology.ca. CA means College of Agriculture. So plantpathology.ca.uky.edu. If you go to the extension page, there's lots of extension publications, including some of the common cankering diseases. I've got some examples up there, fire blight, brown rot of peach, but there are lots of other publications there. In fact, there are hundreds of publications there. So any of those diseases you can learn more about in particular. And of course, our Midwest Fruit Workers production guide is also listed there. Most importantly, get to know your local county extension office. So get to know your agent, ask questions, make sure they know you. They usually try to disseminate as many of these new products as possible as we get new resources. And if needed, they can help you prepare samples for the plant disease diagnostic lab. So we can confirm those diseases, give you a diagnosis, and give you specific recommendations. And finally, social media. We're all on social media, and you can find us at handles KY Plant Disease. We're usually releasing a lot of the newest things there. And you'll also find lists of lots of other resources from the University of Kentucky, not just plant pathology, but horticulture, entomology, weed science. So with that, thank you very much. And again, don't forget to reach out to your county agent and check out our website. Thank you.